Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Parsha is Re'eh. Deuteronomy, and only Deuteronomy, stipulates over 20 times centralized worship is what ultimately became Jerusalem. The Samaritans accepted this centralized approach, but substitute Har Gerizim, Mount Gerizim, for Jerusalem. The Essenes rejected Jerusalem and its corrupt priests and power brokers and moved to the desert to achieve spiritual purity. Finally, the Rabbis chose Yavneh and its scholars. So join us as we declare next year in Yavneh. Well, talking about Jerusalem, welcome back from Jerusalem, Rabbi Mintz.
Thank you so much. It was great to be in Israel, and it's nice to be home, and I'm looking forward to talking about Yavneh and seeing how that tradition developed.
So it's really amazing how every year when you read the Parsha, you focus on different things. And as you'll see, and I'm going to read from the Parsha in a second, we are used to these concepts of going into the promised land and Moses instructing the people to tear down the idols and don't copy the practices. But as I read it this year, the focus was totally different. It was less to do with practices and more to do with places. As I said in the intro, the focus you will see with my emphasis, with the help of my emphasis, is less on these pagan practices and more on centralizing Judaism. So here we go. In Deuteronomy 11:29, it kind of sets a little bit of context. We're going to learn more how much of a context that is. It says, when your God brings you into the land that you are about to enter and possess, you shall pronounce the blessing at Mount Gerizim and the curse at Mount Ebal. And we could easily talk about this concept of when Moses gave his Sermon on the Mount and distinguish between the blessings and the curses. But as I said before, we're focusing on places. So we already have a participant in the conversation. It's a Mount Gerizim, which is associated with blessing. Then we get to Deuteronomy 12, and it says, you must destroy all the sites at Kol HaMakomot, at which the nations you are to dispossess worshipped their gods, whether on lofty mountains and on hills or under any luxuriant tree. Again, the focus is on the places that God is worshipped. Tear down their altars, smash their pillars, put their sacred posts to fire, cut down the images of their gods, obliterating their name from that site. Min hamakom hahu. So again, had it not said min hamakom hahu, I would have thought that we're talking about cutting down images and blotting out idols. But the focus is on place. Do not worship your God in that manner, but look only to the site that your God will choose. Ki im el hamakom asher yivchar Hashem Elokeichem. Amidst all your tribes as God's habitation, to establish the divine name there. There, now we have, instead of saying place, the emphasis is on Sham. There you are to go. And there you are to bring your burnt offerings and other sacrifices, your tithes and contributions, your votive and free will offerings, and the firstlings of your herds and flocks. Together with your household, you shall feast there. Va'achaltem Sham. Before your God. Happy in all your undertakings in which your God has blessed you. You shall not act at all as we now act here, each of us as we please. So it says, you shall kechol asher anachnu osim po, here, ish kol hayashar be'enav. So it is striking, as I reread it, the emphasis really is on the place, on doing it here and not doing it there. It just really struck me in a way that it has never struck me before. And of course, the one word that's not there that you would expect is it doesn't mention Jerusalem. But it is clearly focused on the central worship.
Correct. Now, you have to remember just before you go on that idolatry did not have a central worship. That's a very important thing. Idolatry didn't have one temple. Everybody had a local idol. So it's the opposite. They talk about you need one place. That's in counter-distinction to idolatry, which didn't have a place.
I had never really heard that before. So what you're saying is that idolatry is kind of like totemism and animism, that,
Right.
that God is kind of everywhere.
You worship him in your backyard. You set up an altar in your backyard. That the word for that is bama. The prophets talk about bamot, which are private altars.
And this is not something that we're going to really focus on tonight, but in a sense, you can almost take this thing of centralizing God's worship as almost a sense of removing God from everywhere else and focusing the spiritual in one place. It's almost a sense of secularization, if you think about it, that God is not just everywhere. He's not in everything, or she is not in every act, whatever. There's a focus to it. And that I had thought about in contradistinction to paganism. But I love that insight, and I think you're probably onto something. But in any case, whatever the reason would have been, there's no question that the verses that we just read are not what we expected. They are not, and even the verse that it says, you shall not do after all the things that we do here today, you shall not do as if. I would always normally read that as there was a certain freedom that you've had before. You no longer have that freedom. The commentaries that we're going to discuss don't take it so much as that. They take it with regard to freedom or choice of location. So listen to Rashi. Rashi says, you shall not do after all the things that we do here today. It says, when you pass over the Jordan, meaning being when you cross the Jordan, you are once permitted to offer on bamaz. That's what you had described before, where you literally can create a little bit of a high place and do a sacrifice or something for the 14 years that it took to conquer the land. But on these bamot, you must not sacrifice all that you sacrifice here today. So Rashi makes the distinction, whereas he says, when you are outside of this centralized location, if you make a neder, if you make a peace offering, you can do it. But the sacrifices that you do are not the obligatory sacrifices that you only find in centralized worship. He says not sacrifices that are offered in consequence of an obligation. So again, this kind of freewheeling aspect of it has nothing so much to do with freedom of thought or variation of practice. It has to do with when you have a centralized place of worship, and only when you have a centralized place of worship can you give real sacrifices. Outside, it's stuff that it's kind of like it's amateur, not professional hour, kind of. Is that your read too?
That's my read exactly. Yes.
So again, Ramban does the same thing. He tries to tie it a little bit into the language. The language says, Lo ta'asun kechol asher anachnu osim po hayom. You shall not do like we do everything today. And he says, "Be'ezeh makom shehiyeh hamishkan ya'aseh otam." In whatever place the tabernacle was, they did what they wanted. So he ties in this ya'aseh otam in the sense that only in a place where it is set can you do it. So what I'm struck by the traditional commentaries is how they too pick up on the new read that I had this year, that it is all about location. Even when it talks about something as simple as tearing up their idols, it's in that place, in those places around the country. And so that becomes our focal point as we continue reading. So in Deuteronomy 12:11, it continues, "Then you must bring everything that I command you to the site where your God will choose. V'haya hamakom asher l'saken shemo sham." So now we're talking about a picked place where God will put his holiness. And then in verse 13 it says, "Take care not to sacrifice your burnt offerings in any place you like, but only in the place that God will choose in one of your tribal territories." So, "Hishamer lecha pen ta'aleh olotecha b'chol makom asher tireh, ki im b'makom asher yuchar Hashem." And now it even talks about your tribal areas. So you can understand, Rabbi, how the earliest biblical critics, and we've talked about how the biblical critics look at Deuteronomy and they say it was written in a totally different voice. They believe it was written at a totally different time. One of the earliest ones had a very simple name. His name was Wilhelm Martin Lebrecht de Witt in 1780 to 1849, and he literally uses these verses to say it must have been written after Jerusalem was chosen. It must have been written after the monarchy and the centralization of the priestly cult. So he picked up on this as well. And it clearly is very, very distinctive. And as I said before, it doesn't appear anywhere else in the Torah. One of the sources in the source sheet is from one of my favorite places. It's from thetorah.com. And it says, it's called "The Places That Yahweh Will Choose, Abel, Shiloh, and Jerusalem." So the focus of that article is what's going on here, what is happening. And as I said, it does note that 21 times in Deuteronomy it mentions this place, and it doesn't appear anywhere else. So you could very much understand the argument that this was written after Jerusalem has chosen. Of course, traditional commentaries, and we always pick on Shmuel David Litzato, the Shadal, who was focused on these authorities. You'll see in the source sheet, he actually quotes DeWitt, and he argues with him. He explains that no, his thinking was that the temple or the holy places went from place to place, but they could only be at one place in a time. So that already is an interesting nuance, that it's not so much it has to be in Jerusalem, according Shadal, but it has to be in one place at a time. That's a nice parse, isn't it, Rabbi?
Yeah, that is a nice parse. You see, this idea that we're focused on Jerusalem obviously isn't the point. The point is that it has to be one place. That place turned out to be Jerusalem. But the key is that there was one place. And obviously, that's the issue post-Jerusalem, whether that place can move from Jerusalem or it's always Jerusalem.
Oh, wonderful. You're getting ahead of us. Before we go on to that, let's not forget our friends, the Samaritans and Gerizim. So the Samaritans read the verses that I just read, and I distinctly started with Deuteronomy 11:29, which talks about the blessings and the curses. And they said, well, it says the blessings were at Mount Gerizim, and then it starts hammering away at the place. And this is the source why the Samaritans believe that Har Gerizim up until today is the holy place. But if you take what Shadal said seriously, already we have a difference. It's not simply that the Samaritans picked Gerizim and we picked Jerusalem. If you follow what Shadal is saying, is that the Samaritans took and fixated on one place and said, whatever place we pick, that's the only place it can be. And at least according to rabbinic tradition, the takeaway was that it has to be at one place at a time, but that place can actually be different from time to time. So if you look, for instance, at the Mishnah in Zvachim, it talks about a journey. It says when they first got into the promised land, they went to Gilgal and they set up private altars. And then they went to Shiloh and they set up altars with a building of stone. And then they went into Anov, and then Gibon, and then only finally did they get to Jerusalem. So clearly the Talmud and Shadal are speaking from the same mouth. There was different places that were picked, and the final, and maybe we should put that into quotation marks, but clearly the most important and famous place was the Jerusalem that you were last week in the Holy Land. Interesting little distinctions and nuances between the approaches. Don't you agree?
Absolutely. It's also interesting that Jerusalem is chosen because Jerusalem, if you read the prophets, Jerusalem was only conquered later on in the time of King David. So, afterwards they make it into this, that's the place where Abraham sacrificed Isaac. That's the place where Jacob slept, had his dream. But actually, that's not explicit in the Torah. Jerusalem is not a significant place in the Torah. So it is interesting how Jerusalem was chosen. That's a different topic, but it's something to keep in mind. We kind of take that for granted now that Jerusalem is the holy city. But how exactly did that happen?
And of course, because we are living in the world that we are and politics is all around us, we can't ignore the fact that in today's age, where there are arguments about Jerusalem, a divided city, Jerusalem is the Jews' holiest city, is the Muslims' third holiest city, this whole Olympics of holiness, that your comment is that much more meaningful, because when we're studying Torah, as we are here, with an open eye and an open mind, the truth is that like some other concepts, whether it's the Messiah or whatever, really do not appear in the earliest books of the Bible, and that is no more apparent than in the verses we're studying today. Because if there would have been an opportunity to actually name that place, that would have been here. I mean, you mentioned how the rabbinic tradition is where Jacob rested his head and the angels went up and down the ladder. That was considered where Har HaBayit was built. Where the Akedah was, that was where Har HaBayit. But again, you can read those stories without that. Here,
Yeah, well, that's not, I mean, say it better. That's not explicit in the story, right? That's only rabbinic. That's only midrashic.
Well, absolutely, but you can clearly read it without it. Here,
Right.
its lack of mention is almost glaring, and of course, the higher biblical critic argues that what was happening is that the editor or the writer of this book was trying to put it back in time and didn't want to show his hand by mentioning Jerusalem. It would be like mentioning New York when I'm talking about New Amsterdam. It would be a giveaway that it was written later, and that clearly is the right of a biblical critic to say that. From a more traditional perspective, I follow more in line with what you were saying, which is Jerusalem doesn't play a major role in the 5 books of Moses, period. Fascinating that you can say such a thing, and we'll keep it amongst ourselves when we argue with other religions how important Jerusalem is to us, but that is the case.
Yeah, there's no question that that's true. I mean, Jerusalem is important, but it's really rabbinic. I mean, it's not rabbinic. That's not fair because King David's seat was in Jerusalem. So already, once they conquered Jerusalem, Jerusalem became the center. And you understand why, because there were tribes to the north and tribes to the south. Politically, it was an important place. Not religiously. Politically, it was important because it was right in the middle of the country. And it became religious only afterwards when they built the temple.
It's interesting. I read from the Talmud that talked about all of the different places that the bamot and the quasi sanctuaries were made. So Koenigsberg, the guy who wrote that article in thetorah.com, he says, notably, the rabbis skip over Mount Ebal entirely, following the priestly conception of a wilderness tabernacle being established in Shiloh. Perhaps this was due to anti-Samaritan polemic. So the bottom line is you cannot read the Bible and talk about geography without getting polemical. And his point is that when they wrote their choreography of the different places that temples were built and all that, they left out Har Eval, which is to eliminate the position of the Samaritans. It's unfortunately just the way it is, but another way of saying it is that the Torah is a book that has always been extremely relevant to the current times. It's not something that's gathering dust.
That's right. I think that's absolutely right. And this story and the position of Jerusalem and all these things evolved over time.
Absolutely. And they're part of our history. What I mentioned in the intro is the Essenes. We all know the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the Judean desert, and there was a community there who was living following heightened laws of purity. Clearly, they had distanced themselves, moved away from the main society, in particular the urban area of Jerusalem. And they have scrolls called the Temple Scroll and others. And there's no question that this concept, which was really taken a large part by Christianity of a new Jerusalem, I would say was possibly taken by the Kabbalists in Yerushalayim Shel Mala, a spiritual Jerusalem. Clearly was the rubber hit the road with the Essenes. The Essenes, and I'm quoting something I took right out of Wikipedia, according to the sectarian compositions, Jerusalem is ungodly. Illegitimate and wicked priesthood occupy it, so it's no surprise that the Qumranites, the place where they lived was Qumran, abandoned it. As Qumran, they believed themselves to be establishing the true temple, since the other had been corrupted. Furthermore, the community itself metaphorically believed they were the new Jerusalem and the new temple. So we're kind of traveling the whole gamut. We start in the first 4 books of Moses, or I should say really in starting with Exodus, with this traveling temple. the Mishkan. And it's truly there that we learn all the laws of sacrifices and all the laws of making a place that God will live within them, whatever that means. And now we get to Deuteronomy, and all of a sudden we feel this centralization, this putting it into a particular place. And now we're going fast forward to when things were starting to fall apart. So the Samaritans, they stuck with their Har Eval. They weren't moving. But the Essenes and those who really felt that the Second Temple, God's presence never really came to it, they rejected the corruption and the political play that was going on in Jerusalem, and they moved out into the desert, and they created a mystical New Jerusalem, if you will. So it's kind of like we said before that Shadal and the Talmud talks about it's got to be in one place. Now this became of interesting. It was a one place, but it was a place that was more than just a place. It was it almost left the place behind, and we're going to use this to transition into what Yochanan ben Zakkai did because he fits right into the puzzle. It was at the same time that the Essenes had left Jerusalem. They did it gradually over many years, but as we studied 2 weeks ago, Yochanan ben Zakkai, he kind of wiped his hand of Jerusalem too. We thought it was a compromise, a word that you and I were discussing a few minutes ago. But if you look at it from this perspective, it actually becomes the next step. And that's fascinating. But what do you think about this New Jerusalem concept, whether it's Christianity or the Kabbalists or the Qumranites? They weren't willing to give up on a holy place, but it actually the paradigm changed.
You always need a place. Every religion has a place. The Muslims have Mecca. The Christians have Bethlehem. Everybody needs a place because you need to centralize worship. Now, it's interesting, just to talk about the development of Judaism, that once Jerusalem was destroyed and the Jews went into exile, the synagogue became the place. Means it was no longer a city. We created a miniature Jerusalem in our synagogues. And the rabbis speak about the synagogue as being a mikdash ma'at, as being a small temple. Because if there's no temple, we need to create our own temple. So what's interesting is that even now we need a place. It's not a city, but we need a place. And Christianity has a place. And it's interesting that in Islam, every Muslim man once in his life needs to make a pilgrimage to Mecca. That's the place. You have to go to Mecca, even today. In Judaism, we don't have that anymore. In Judaism, there was a time when the temple was standing that the men used to go 3 times a year for the holidays. They used to go to Jerusalem. We don't have that law anymore since there's no longer a temple. But isn't that interesting that the Muslims still have it?
Well, it's interesting, and we actually use the same word because what the Muslims call it is the Hajj, and we call it the Chag. It comes from the same Semitic letters. But so what we in the closing minutes, I discovered in my research, and I shared with you, Rabbi, yesterday, an amazing article by Shia Cohen. Shia Cohen is a first-class biblical scholar. And this is an article I think he wrote early on in his career. It might even been his dissertation. And it's the significance of Yavneh and the end of Jewish sectarianism. And what he argues is in line with what I was talking about before, about taking the model of a Jerusalem, but paradigm shifting it is that when Yochanan ben Zakkai, as we mentioned 2 weeks ago, says, Tain li Yavneh, he wasn't only asking for Yavneh, he was also to a large degree rejecting, or if you want to be a little bit less pronounced, leaving Jerusalem. You know, there was a midrash that I quoted a few weeks ago in Avot Rav Natan that says that once Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai left Jerusalem, and Rabbi Yeshua followed after him, and he saw the holy temple destroyed. Rabbi Yeshua said, Woe to us, for this is destroyed, the place where all Israel's sins are forgiven through the sacrifices. And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, My son, do not be distressed, for we have a form of atonement just like it. And what is it? Acts of kindness. So I always read this as something very positive. It was compensation. But if you read it from the perspective that we're going to go through now, he actually was saying, do not be sad. We have something different. We are going in a new direction. And so Shai Cohen writes, he said that really the source of so many of the sects in Judaism that Josephus talks about was actually the temple. The sects debated many different laws, but the specific halachot, which always stood at the heart of Jewish sectarianism, were the laws related to the temple. A common feature of Jewish sectarianism is the polemic against the Temple of Jerusalem. Its precincts are impure, its cult profane, its priests illegitimate. And just as the Jerusalem temple claimed to be the only authentic house of God, so too the sects, which saw themselves either explicitly or implicitly as the replacements or equivalents of the temple, advanced exclusive claims to the truth. Only they understood God's will, and only they performed God's law correctly. The world which produced Jewish sectarianism, nurtured it, gave it meaning, disappeared in the year 70. This is Shai Held's thesis. And he says the destruction of the temple facilitated the emergence of individuals as authority figures to replace the institutional authority. The Mishnah is the first work of Jewish antiquity which ascribes conflicting legal opinions to name individuals who, in spite of their disagreements, belong to the same fraternity. You have to go to the source sheet. You have to read the complete excerpts. It's what he does is he says that he didn't simply settle for Yavneh. What he created in Yavneh was a new approach, and he didn't simply replace one makom, one place for another, but he substituted individual opinion for the singular makom. I mean, he gets into the fact that in Yavneh there was it says that there are birchot haminim, the blessing against what I always thought were the people that didn't believe. Shai Cohen interprets that means that people who believe there's only one answer. I mean, it's radical, but this is from a first-class scholar.
His article is brilliant. The idea is that Yavneh was the great unifier. That's the bottom line. Yavneh was the great unifier. It's a great article. It's a great topic. And this was, the idea of the place is really really interesting to develop that idea. So thank you so much for bringing that up tonight. And thank you everybody for joining us. Have a great Shabbat. Next week we'll do a lunch and learn. We will talk about Parshat Shoftim. It's going to be the month of Elul next week already. So we're going to be looking forward, starting to think about Rosh Hashanah. Have a great Shabbat, everybody. A great week. And thank you, Geoffrey.
Thank you, Rabbi. Next week we will be bi-coastal and looking forward to it. But please, if you happen to be in synagogue this Shabbat and you read the Parsha, focus on what we focused on today. It will change the way you read it, and think in terms of Yavneh as an alternative. And the last thing that I'll say is one thing that I haven't mentioned about what's going on in Israel is the distinction between Jerusalem and the rest of the country, between the central Israel and the periphery. And one way that you can take Yavneh is clearly take Judaism out into the periphery, outside of the hallways of a Knesset, and listen to the people. And I think that too is an amazing message that gets us back to the message of V'shechanti b'tocham, that God dwells within each one of us. So Shabbat Shalom, and see you
Shabbat
all
shalom.
next week.
Thank you so much. Be well. Bye-bye.
Make sure to share our podcast with friends and family. Give us a few stars. Say something nice. And in the meantime, we'll see you all next week.